In this video, we're going to talk about decorative images. This video is sponsored by DocAccess, but more on that later. Welcome to the Accessibility Guide channel. My name is Sean Jordison, and let's jump into the ring. Now, I often get asked about decorative images, and the best description I can give you in whether or not to mark an image as decorative is if that image adds any additional value to the context or information we are learning about. Now, it's hard to talk about decorative images without first talking about alternate text. I always use this example. If I were to pick up a phone and call one of my friends, how would I describe the image I'm looking at? Is it important for me to call out all the individual components of that image, or is it simply better to describe the overarching takeaway of that graphic or image? And so what if we had an image of some sunglasses here? This is an icon, but we're talking about maybe the accessibility guy. Now, in this particular example, those sunglasses don't really add any additional value. If I picked up the phone and I called somebody, I don't think it's gonna make any sense to be like, I'm looking at a logo of some sunglasses. However, if the accessibility guy were to release a line of sunglasses that maybe had the logo and were totally accessible, then I would wanna provide detailed alternate text. However, in this example, I'm simply going to right-click the image and choose View Alt Text, and we have this handy button to mark it as decorative in Microsoft Word. Now, there are many other examples where we can mark images as decorative. For example, if we decided to put a company logo in the header of our Microsoft Word document, and then just for fun, what if we had multiple pages? So I just created 21 pages of content that all include my company logo. It doesn't make any sense to provide alternate text for every single one of those examples. I might include it just on page 1. However, in this example, I'm simply going to mark it as decorative because it doesn't add any additional value to the context of my document. Some other examples that you might simply just mark as decorative are simple things like stock photos. If I show a picture of a person shaking hands as an example, that's a great image to mark as decorative because it doesn't add any additional value or information to what I'm talking about. You should also mark things as decorative for things like background gradients, textures, different types of lines and styles, any types of divider lines or arrows. Again, that information should be marked as decorative unless it adds more value. Let's take a look at this episode's sponsor, DocAccess. I've pulled up a random document in my DocAccess viewer, and when I select my accessible transcript view, I can get this document as accessible HTML. Now, what I want to show you in here is the default settings right now for DocAccess is to write alternate text for every image that it finds. So in this example, we have a close-up photo of a judge's gavel and sound block in the foreground. With a blurred background showing a person holding scales of justice, the image conveys a legal or judicial setting. Let's go back and determine if that's true. And it totally is a great image description for that image. Now, we also have a logo description. And so when we use an automated tool where we're not actually having to spend extra time determining whether or not something is decorative, it's okay to have detailed alternate text for every logo in our file. Now, if I go back to my Microsoft Word document, I'm choosing to make my logo decorative, but some people want to have alternate text. If you want to try out DocAccess for yourself, there's a link in the description to book a demo with me, and I'll show you the ins and outs of this amazing product. Now let's get back to the video. Now let's talk about some examples that we would want to actually write alternate text. Let's take a look at this awesome photo in my sample document. I'm gonna view the alt text. In this example, we have professional wrestling scene. A suited man angrily points and shouts at a bald wrestler wearing an Austin 316 shirt with a championship belt over his shoulder. This is somewhat of a boring alt text in my opinion. I would rather have this other piece of information in here where we have this iconic late 1990s WWE rivalry between Vince McMahon and Stone Cold Steve Austin, a storyline that defined the Attitude Era. That would be a much better alternate text as it provides additional context. Like, if you didn't watch wrestling growing up, you probably wouldn't know who these people are. And so that alt text provides that additional context for me. What about if we have a chart and graph? Well, in this example, we have different attendance and pay-per-view buys for a few different wrestling events. Now, in this example, I simply provide the main takeaway. I say WrestleMania 20 had the highest pay-per-view buys with 1 million buys. Now, if I wanted to, I could go in depth and explain all the individual events and the individual buys. But because I'm the author, I am choosing to just give the main takeaway as my alternate text. Some other examples where you may want to have alternate text is for when you use icons that give clear value to the user. Let's put the Band-Aid icon in here. And let's just pretend that the Band-Aid icon throughout this document meant some wrestler got hurt, or perhaps I wanted to call special attention to something. This would be an area where I would want to add alternate text, especially if we're using it multiple times throughout our document. This is because it's going to help the learner understand visually, oh, this section is about wrestlers getting hurt. And if that is a theme throughout the document, we're going to want to be able to quickly identify that. And so if the point is to bring extra visual attention, I would say you should apply alternate text to those cases. Now, if the Band-Aid had nothing to do with anything and I just liked the way that it looked, I simply could mark it as decorative. So I came up with a short list to help you determine whether or not you should write alternate text for an image. Does the image add information that the text doesn't include? If yes, you should add descriptive alt text. If no, simply mark it as decorative. Here's another question you can ask yourself. Would a sighted reader learn something from seeing it? If yes, it's meaningful and you should write alternate text. If no, mark it as decorative. Would removing the image change understanding? If yes, it is not decorative and you should give it alternate text. If no, you can mark it decorative. All right, that concludes today's video on determining whether or not an image is decorative. If you want to find out how I can help you get accessible, book a meeting with me right now. There's a link in the description. And as always, I can be your champion for inclusion. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.